Italy does a lot of good things with their diet. A lot of things that other areas of the world could certainly adopt and have benefit. But there's one particular thing that really stands out above all else. And at first, when you look at it, you're like, oh, wow, that just makes a ton of sense. But it's also pretty broad, so we need to unpack it a little bit more than just what's on the surface. Now, if you look at the total intake of different kinds of carbohydrates and different kinds of fats and this and that, throughout the Mediterranean, it's not wildly different. Yet, interestingly enough, different regions of the Mediterranean have different rates of mortality risk and different longevity and this and that. So clearly there's some different things going on. So let's talk about what Italy does. And I'll tell you first and foremost what it is, but stick with me so you can understand what it is. The types of processed food that Italy eats are totally different. Not just the amount, the types. So let's get into it. And after today's video, I put a link to our sponsor, Seed, which is a daily synbiotic. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, add a probiotic into the mix. If you're not eating a good amount of probiotic-rich foods or fermented foods, which if you're doing that, that's great, totally. 100% whole food form all the way. But a probiotic does make sense. And I don't recommend literally any probiotics other than Seed because they actually put their money where their mouth is with their clinical research. They publish trials even if they don't fall in favor of their particular brand. It's pretty cool and it's honest, and that's what I like about them. So that link down below is for 25% off their daily synbiotic, which is a capsule inside of a capsule. So it's a multi-stage prebiotic and a probiotic that breaks down kind of in your digestive system as it goes. So proper potential colonization of the species. Anyhow, check them out because they really do their homework and they put their money where their mouth is. So that link down below for Seed's Daily Synbiotic, I think you'll probably notice a difference within a couple of weeks, possibly even a couple of days after taking it. So link top line of the description underneath this video. Italy's ultra-processed food consumption is 4.1%. Now, if we compare that to, let's say, for example, Greece. Greece is another Mediterranean country with low ultra-processed foods, 5.9%. Spain also between 5.9 and 6.1%. Okay, you look at the Netherlands, more like 20-ish to 25, the UK 20 to 30, United States possibly even 45, 50, 65 plus. Okay, we don't need to go there. The point is, first and foremost, top down, their processed food intake is quite low. And what's interesting is they eat a fair bit of starch, right? No one's gonna deny that pasta, rice, certain things like this, depending on what region of Italy, I would go so far as even saying staples. Like you go to Italy, yeah, a lot of things are carbohydrate based. There's also a lot of things that in the United States, we don't really talk about because we kind of like frame the Mediterranean as like this certain kind of thing, when in reality, the Mediterranean is much more like fish and seafood and healthy fats, and yes, the pasta's in there, but yes, there's also antioxidants, there's also greens, there's also lifestyle, there's also meal timing and sequencing and spacing and protein spacing, all that aside. Let's investigate a little bit more about their processed food, but more importantly, let's understand the risk reduction that comes with implementing their kind of diet. So first and foremost, there was a large meta-analysis that looked at lots of different regions of the Mediterranean, but the bulk of the regions they looked at were in Italy. So there were 4 particular studies with lots of follow-up periods. One with a 50-year follow-up period, meaning they went back and checked on them 50 years later, a 17-year follow-up, a 4-year follow-up, and a 12-year follow-up. So longer-term studies, pretty interesting stuff. They found that the higher the adherence to the Italian-style Mediterranean diet, there was a 30 to 40% reduction in all-cause mortality. What that means in kind of human terms is the more that you adhere to that Mediterranean version, that Italian version, there was a strong risk reduction, which means it's worth your while to do what they were doing. Okay, now you compare that to, say, Greece, for example, not quite as much of a risk reduction. So what that tells us is, okay, we need to see where the differences are. And if you look mainly at the processed food differences, Italians consume a fair bit of processed food coming from their cured meats and coming from sausages and things like that. Interesting. Whereas Greece, their processed foods, the meats and the cured meats don't even make their top 5. You know what makes their top 5? 20% of their ultra-processed food consumption is coming from cracker-like products, bread-like products, refined starches. they're creeping towards a little bit more of what America is doing. Now, I'm not saying this is the only thing, not by any stretch. Please don't misconstrue my words. But what I am saying is that 11 to 17% of the already very low processed food in Italy is coming from cured meats, which aren't bad. That's meat and salt usually, or sausages. It's wild, right? So we learn from that, okay, not only is their processed food intake low, but the types of processed food that they are consuming are really not the normal kind of processed foods that you and I might think of. When you're watching me, you're thinking, when I talk processed foods, I'm personally thinking like hyper palatable Twinkies, maybe a Little Debbie's cake here and there, maybe a home run pie. Do you still eat those? I don't know if they even still exist. But I'm certainly not thinking prosciutto, and I'm certainly not thinking maybe a little bit of salami. But in the case of the Mediterranean, that is roped into their processed food to a certain degree. So it's quite fascinating that one of the biggest things that Italy does different is consumes less processed food, yet they are consuming a fair bit of pastas and starches and pizzas and grains and cereals and high sugar fruits, but yet they still have significant improvements in quality of life and reductions in all-cause mortality. Now, I'm going to touch on Spain for just a second. I've done other videos on Spain, so I don't want to repeat stuff too much. Spain has actually the best effect in terms of risk reduction with the implementation of their diet. So the more that Spaniards adhere to their diet, they get up to a 67% improvement in all-cause mortality. And this is just data. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all 100% real life. But what they consume more of, they have a higher consumption of meat, fish, and eggs. Now, Italy has a lower consumption of meat, fish, and eggs, but they do have a higher consumption of dairy, and they're getting a good amount of protein from dairy. So the Spaniards consume a little bit more protein, for sure, but they also have a higher processed food intake. Whereas Italy has one of the highest, if not the highest quality of life in the Mediterranean. Now, you could break it down into different areas, of course, Sardinia, Sicily, whatever, but one of the highest quality of life. Now, you factor that in along with their processed food consumption and their overall food consumption in general, and their BMI. It's quite interesting because Spain has a little bit of a higher BMI than Italy. And if you look at the literature, they both walk a lot. Italy is definitely a little bit more pedestrian than Spain because there's different parts of Spain, yada, yada. Again, large landmass, lots of differences in between. But without getting too overly granular, I think we can all take a step back and we can say, okay, Italy is doing something right. They consume gluten. There's no issue there. When I was in Italy, I could consume gluten and not have the problems that I have here. And I find it rather mysterious, and I can't explain 100% why. I know there is some reasons why, but I'd be speculating if I were to pick one out. Bottom line, things were different. The quality of food was different, but most importantly, my satiety was different. So when we look at this big picture and they're only consuming 4% of their food from processed food, of course they're going to feel more satisfied. They're going to be satiated. They're not going to want to overeat. So no wonder their BMI is lower. No wonder their longevity is better. No wonder their overall just quality of life is just better. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.